My charge is to talk a little bit about the empirical theories and or the psychological theories and research behind a lot of the work that went into Common Cause and that went into the Meeting Environmental Challenges book that Tom and I worked on. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on issues of values here. And eventually be talking about how that may be relevant to the communication strategies and the campaigns that you all do across a variety of different kinds of challenges that we face. And you'll also have to excuse me, I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so hopefully that won't be an issue though as I'm speaking. So what are values and goals? Well, values and goals from a psychological perspective can be thought of as the guiding principles that we have in life, okay? So here we are, we're thrown into life and we have to figure out what we're going to do with our life, right? And so our values and our goals are what tell us how to make our decisions. That's not the only thing that tells us how to guide our lives, but it's one of the things. We know from the psychological research that the values and goals that people have a variety of different kinds of effects in terms of what their people's lives end up looking like. So for example, we know from a variety of types of studies that if you value something, it affects your attitudes towards other things, okay? So if I value image a great deal, for example, I probably want to read magazines like Cosmopolitan or GQ or whatever, okay? Because that's the sort of thing that I might like to care about. If I value other kinds of things like money, maybe I read Forbes or the Wall Street Journal or whatever the equivalent here is in the UK, okay? Our values also affect our attitudes towards particular political issues. So the policies that are presented to us by the government or that bubble up from below are also influenced by values, the values that people have. And then when I see a particular policy presentation, my values end up influencing whether that's something I think I want to support or not. Obviously, values also end up influencing our behaviors, okay? So if I care about something like, let's say, helping the world be a better place, that's the sort of thing which might lead me in particular to take a job that will lead me to make less money than I might otherwise, so that I can do something that fits my values to try to help the world. Professors don't make nearly as much money as you might think, and campaigners, I know, are in a similar position. Similarly, though, if I care a lot about values like money and image, I'm probably going to spend my Saturdays visiting the mall and looking for clothes or what have you. Now, one of the things we know from the research is that there are a variety of different types of values and goals which exist, but there aren't an infinite number, okay? There are a relatively limited number of values and goals which people have identified in the empirical research. And I can't give you an exact number like there are 7 or 42 or whatever, but it is finite. And one of the things we do know, though, is that those values and goals seem to cluster together in some meaningful and replicable ways. And this is one of the, I think, most important aspects of the work that I'm going to be talking about today here. Because one of the things you have to remember is that values are organized in systems. No single value for money or for religion or for helping the world be a better place exists by itself. Values are part of a system of values, okay? The way that I like to think about this system of values is it's like a big pie, okay, divided into slices. And each of us has all of those slices, as we'll be talking about, but the slices of pie are different size. So for example, if you care a great deal about spirituality, you might have a slice of pie for spirituality that's quite big. Okay? But maybe you don't care about spirituality at all, and you've just got a little sliver. Okay? Now, all of those values are there in the system, but they're organized in a particular set of ways. And this work has been validated in literally dozens of nations around the world, okay? And one of the things that's most fascinating and probably most counterintuitive for a lot of us raised in the postmodern age is that these values and goals seem to express themselves and seem to organize themselves in relatively similar ways regardless of where you live in the world. And regardless of whether you live in a rich nation or a poor nation, an Eastern nation or a Western nation, a Northern or a Southern nation, okay? This is what the research has shown thus far. Now, that's not to say it's exactly the same, okay? I'm not trying to make that argument, but the similarities are stronger than the differences in terms of how these systems are organized. Now, what we find when we do the analyses on the data that we get from these various nations is that values are organized in a way such that some values are compatible with each other and others are in conflict with each other. So what this means is that as we think about how those slices of the value pie are organized, some values are right next to each other, okay? And they're compatible, which means they're relatively easy to simultaneously pursue and to think about. Those values get along, okay? Other values are in conflict with each other, and I'll show you this more here in a second, okay, such that it's very difficult for people to simultaneously care about both of those values, okay? They tend to stand in opposition to each other. And again, I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Now, what you can do statistically is you can represent the extent of conflict or compatibility with different kinds of statistical techniques, multidimensional scaling analysis or circular stochastic modeling, etc. I won't bore you with all of those details, but what I want you to know is that the figures that I'm about to show you next here are not theoretical ideas that psychologists just thought up in their head, okay? They're not pictures of theories. They're pictures of data that have been collected from tens of thousands of people around the world in dozens of nations, okay? And what these statistical techniques are able to do is to model the extent of compatibility or conflict between those values by placing the values along a circle, okay, or into a circular formation. And these are called circumplex models as a result. And what you're going to see here is that values which are compatible with each other are going to be nearby each other, and values which are in conflict with each other are on opposite side of the circles. Now, I'm going to show you two different models. The first one is, this is the model of Shalom Schwartz, who has been doing work on value research from the early 1990s and was actually a big inspiration for me when I was a graduate student. There's a lot of information up here, and I don't want you to try to attend to it all, okay? What I want you to attend to is two or three main things. The first thing here I want you to notice are these values, the self-enhancement values. Now, these are values for achievement and power. The fact that they are next to each other suggests that when people care a lot about power, they also tend to care about achievement. And when people care about achievement, they tend to care about power. Okay? That's why these values are next to each other, and that's how people experience the values, okay, based on Schwartz's data. Now, the self-enhancing values are values where you're trying to enhance yourself. You're trying to get ahead. You're trying to attain social power or wealth, which gives you power, authority, which also puts you above other people and enhances you, being successful and influential. These are actual items that people rate in Schwartz's research. They rate as to whether or not this is not at all important or extremely important or whatever. So these are the kinds of values that make up the self-enhancing values. Now, if we take a look at this chart here, this circumplex model, what we see is that the self-enhancement models are opposed by the self-transcendence values, okay? And these self-transcendence values are what are called universalism and benevolence. What this means is that when people care a fair bit about universalism, they also care about benevolence and vice versa, but that there's a relative conflict between caring about these values and caring about these values. Now, what are those specific self-transcendent values? Well, those are for, and these are again are actual items, values for being helpful, responsible, having mature love, social justice, equality, a world of beauty, and protecting the environment. So what this circumplex model demonstrates is that to the extent people are focused on those self-enhancing values for power, status, achievement, they're relatively disinclined to care much about the self-transcendent values for helpfulness, social equality, etc. And vice versa. To the extent people are going to care about those self-transcending values, they're going to be less likely to care about the self-enhancing values. Now here's another circumplex, which is work that I've done with Fred Grouzet and not quite as many nations as Schwartz has, with a somewhat different measure. But you're going to find that there are some very big similarities here. So here we have what we call the extrinsic values for popularity, image, and financial success. Now these are next to each other on the circumplex, which means they're compatible with each other psychologically. And that makes sense, right? You know, why do people care about image? Well, oftentimes because they want to be popular. And what do you need in order to have popularity in an image? You got to have some money usually. Okay? So these are all values which we call extrinsic. The reason that we call them extrinsic is because they're focused on rewards, they're focused on praise, they're focused on these external things outside of you. And again, here are some of the sample items that we ask people to rate to assess how much they care about these particular goals. Now these extrinsic values or goals are opposed by what we call the intrinsic goals, okay? And you'll notice that these are somewhat similar to the ones we saw with Schwartz, okay? Here we're talking about community, which is trying to make the broader world a better place, affiliation, which is having close relationships, and self-acceptance, which is growing as a person here. I'm going to be talking mostly about the affiliation, the community values here, but here are some of the intrinsic values. Intrinsic values from our theoretical perspective are intrinsic because they meet intrinsic psychological needs that all people seem to have. And they're also intrinsically rewarding to pursue. Now, why does all this matter? Okay, why is this relevant to you as campaigners? Well, there's two main reasons that I think it's relevant, and here's what I'm going to show you next. The first reason is that we know from the empirical research that the more that people have a value disposition in one way or the other, the more it is related to their social ecological attitudes and behaviors. Essentially, what you're going to see from the data here in a moment is that the more that people are focused on those self-enhancing and extrinsic values for money and status and power, the less likely they are inclined to care about helping other people and to care about the environment and to engage in behaviors which help the environment and which help other people. On the other hand, to the extent people are focused on those intrinsic values and those self-transcendent values, for things like helpfulness and things like social justice and things like making the world a better place, the more likely they are to have these positive attitudes and engage in helpful behaviors. So let's talk about some of that research. And we're going to start with the social correlates here. So first, let's talk about social attitudes. One of the things we know is that the more people are focused on those extrinsic self-enhancing values, the less empathic they are. Okay? So they're less likely to agree with a statement like this. Now obviously, for those of us who are interested in trying to help mobilize people to care about those who are less fortunate, we want them to be empathic, right? We want them to understand this person is suffering. But people who are focused on those self-enhancing extrinsic values are less empathic, whereas people who are focused on the intrinsic transcendent values report more empathy. We also know that the extrinsic self-transcending or self-enhancing people are more Machiavellian. You might remember Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, which was a guidebook for how to obtain and maintain power, and the basic answer is manipulate other people when needed. Okay? What we know from the research is that extrinsically oriented people are more Machiavellian. Okay? They're more likely to use other people as pawns in their game. We also know that extrinsic and self-enhancing individual score higher in what's called social dominance orientation. This is a well-researched psychological orientation whereby basically I think my group is better than your group. Okay? And furthermore, I think your group deserves whatever problems it has because you're stupid or lazy or whatever it is. Okay? That's the essential idea of a social dominance orientation. Extrinsically oriented people are more socially dominant, intrinsically are less. Now again, that has pretty big relevance for trying to mobilize people to help people who are different from them, right? And finally, very relevant here, we know that people who are more oriented towards those extrinsic self-enhancing values say things that express higher racial and ethnic prejudice. Okay? So again, it's going to be difficult to mobilize people to help people in other continents who maybe share different or have different ethnicities and races than the donor, if you will, to the extent that they are more extrinsically oriented. On the other hand, intrinsically, self-transcendently oriented people are less prejudiced from the data. And by the way, these are all the citations, obviously, from the scientific research. Now, this isn't just about attitudes, it's also about actual behavior. So in some studies, what we've been able to find is that the more that people are focused on the intrinsic transcendent values, the more likely they are to engage in pro-social behavior, like helping other individuals, and the less likely they are to engage or report engaging in antisocial behaviors like stealing and cheating and such like that. The reverse happens for those extrinsic. We also know that if you put people in a situation where they are playing a game with other individuals and you give them the opportunity to either compete or cooperate, this is what's called the prisoner's dilemma game. You may have heard of that. It's a very famous social and economic psychology research tool that is used, where you can score points either by cooperating or competing. We know that the more oriented you are in an intrinsic fashion towards those goals for helping other people, the more likely you cooperate. The more you're focused on money and status and power, the more likely you are to choose to compete or get ahead, which of course has negative ramifications for everybody else you're playing with, right? Okay, now there are also obviously problems with these values with regard to ecological outcomes. So with regard to things like climate change, pollution, loss of biodiversity, habitat, etc. So for example, as with social attitudes, we know that the more people focus on those self-enhancing extrinsic values, the less they care about protecting the environment and having a world of beauty. That was part of the fundamental circumplex I showed you at the outset. We also know that the more that you care about those self-enhancing values for power and status, the less you care about the effects of environmental damage on other people, so people who are living in low-lying areas, the less you care about how it might affect animals, and the less you care about how it might affect future generations. You might care how it affects you, but you don't care how it affects anybody else. On the flip side, the self-transcending people are more concerned about how environmental damage might affect people in Bangladesh or pandas or people 3 generations from now. Similarly, there are effects on behavior. We know that the more people are focused on those extrinsic money-oriented values, the less likely they are to ride bicycles, to recycle, to reuse, etc. This has been demonstrated in several studies now. And in a recent study that Astrid Mathy and I did, we brought people into we basically set up our own grocery store inside the lab that had organic and non-organic choices for chocolate and coffee and all of the rest. We got them thinking about values beforehand, and what we found was that if people thought about self-enhancing values right before they went shopping, then they were less likely to buy the organics products. Whereas if they thought about universalism values right before they went shopping, then they were more likely to buy the organic products. Furthermore, this was really interesting, we gave them a choice of bags to bring their stuff home in, and the people who thought about the self-enhancing values were more likely to take the plastic bag, and the people who thought about the self-transcending values were more likely to say, nah, I don't need a bag, I'll just carry it. Okay? We also know that these values are associated with the size of one's ecological footprint. So one's basically, which is made up of transportation, housing, and food choices. People who are more oriented in extrinsic ways towards money, status, etc., have higher ecological footprints than do those who are oriented in an intrinsic fashion. In a paper that I have coming out here in a couple of months, we took this idea and we scaled it up to the nation level. So what I was able to do was to look at 20 different wealthy nations, mostly Western Europe, North America, Australia, etc. And we were able to get, using Schwartz's measure, a measure of how much the citizens in each nation cared about, on the one hand, values for achievement, power, status, those enhancing values, versus how much they cared about loyalty, helpfulness, etc., i.e. those transcendent values. And we correlated those with CO2 emissions, and we found even after you control for GDP per capita, the more that a nation cares about those enhancing values, the higher its carbon emissions. I would also note, this is not exactly relevant to the ecological issues, but do you all remember the UNICEF Innocenti report on children's well-being that came out a couple of years ago? How many of you remember that, know that report? Okay, it rank ordered 21 wealthy nations in terms of their children's well-being. You guys know where UK scored? 21. US was 20th. And we also found that this measure of values predicted standing on the Innocenti report. The more the nation's citizens cared about achievement, power, status, and money, the lower children's well-being in the nation. So that's a social issue too, I suppose. Okay, so what I've tried to show you here is the first main implication that I think is relevant to you. Okay, that what happens is that the more people generally say, yeah, what's important to me is making a lot of money and having a lot of status, etc., the less likely they are to engage in the kinds of behaviors and to hold the kinds of attitudes that I imagine most of your campaigns are oriented towards. Okay? Whereas the intrinsic and self-transcendent values are ones which are going to be more supportive of the kinds of campaigns now that you are probably doing. Now, most of this work that I've shown you, in fact, I think all of the work I've shown you thus far is just correlational. Okay? It just shows how this variable is associated with that variable. What I'm going to show you now is some experimental data that will get at causal issues, and that also raises what I think is the second important implication I'd like you to be thinking about here. The idea here is that when you activate one set of values, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be supporting and encouraging attitudes and behaviors which are consistent with those values, and you're going to be suppressing and discouraging the attitudes and behaviors that are in conflict with those values. I know that's very abstract. Let me show you what I mean by that by going back to this circumplex. What I'm going to show you next are some data which essentially show that if you get people thinking for a moment about achievement, they're going to think also about power and other achievement values, and they're not going to be thinking about universalism and benevolence. So what's happening is that if you activate values here, there's like a bleed over. It sort of spreads into similar compatible values and says, yeah, do those and care about those. And it suppresses the values on the other side. Said in terms of this circumplex, you get people thinking about image and popularity. If you get people thinking about image, they're going to think about popularity and money too. And they're not going to be caring about the stuff over here. And vice versa. You get people thinking about affiliation and community, or you get people thinking about affiliation, they're going to think about community, and they're going to suppress this end of their value system. So everybody got that basic idea? This first set of work is done by Greg here, so I'm stealing some of his thunder, but I think he knows I'm doing that. Okay, so essentially what he did here in one of his studies was he brought Cardiff students into the lab and he measured how much they cared about self-enhancing, self-transcendence, or other values, their disposition. How much do you care about these? And then he told them one of three things. Either that other Cardiff students really cared about self-transcendence values, other Cardiff students really cared about self-enhancement values, or the third group was a control group that just memorized something irrelevant. Then they were given another value measure with new values, not the same ones they had here, but new ones, okay, that were also self-enhancing, self-transcendent, etc. And what did he find? Well, here's your change in self-transcendent values. If you had just been told that a bunch of people in your university cared about self-transcendence, it made you care about self-transcendence more later, but look what it did to, but if you had just been told that other people cared about self-enhancement, it actually suppressed your self-transcendence values. Thinking your peers care about self-enhancement made you care less about self-transcendence. Here's what happened with self-enhancement values, okay? If you'd been told your peers care about self-enhancement, then you cared more. Look what happened if you were told that self-transcendence is what they cared about. You cared less about self-enhancement values. Similar effects with behavior. So here, they were given lists of words. They had to sort them, adjectives, items of furniture, and either benevolence-related words, achievement-related words, or food-related words. So we're just activating benevolence or achievement here. And then they were asked, will you volunteer some time? If you had just been sorting words about benevolence, you volunteered significantly more time than if you had just been sorting words about achievement. That's all you were doing, was just sorting a bunch of words. All Greg did was turn on that part of the circumplex, and it had an effect on how much you volunteered later. We can find similar effects for social behavior, but I'm going to have to skip through this in the interest of time. But basically, this replicates it. You find it for time spent helping, number of pencils gathered, even for donations, by the way, too. Just getting people to think about money makes them donate less. Activation of eco-attitudes. So let's say the same thing for ecological outcomes. This is a study we've just published. You're only the second people to hear about it. Okay, so what we did was we brought people into the lab. These were Americans. We had them either think about what it was to be a human, what it was to be a University of Missouri student, or what it was to be an American. And then we had them think, but then we had two other groups still. Either an American, and we reminded them America is the land of Hollywood and where you can make all the money you want. Or, don't laugh now, America is a generous country where you can express yourself and pursue family values, okay? So one of 5 different groups, okay, that you're thinking about who you are. And then we said, imagine that the president asks you to recommend what Americans' ideal ecological footprint would be 5 years from now. And they filled out 11 questions about that, okay, to say, well, 5 years from now, this should be the average American ecological footprint. And here's what we found. These are the recommended ecological footprints. By getting people to think about an intrinsic American identity, an American identity of being generous and self-expressing and valuing their family, people recommended a significantly lower ecological footprint than any of the other groups. Okay? Americans is the worst, actually, here. Okay? But just by thinking about that, and note, we never mentioned the environment. When people were thinking about an intrinsic American identity, we never even mentioned the environment. It just bled over into the environment. You can find the same thing with other studies Martin von Steenkiest has done too, but I don't have time for that. So just to wrap up, when you use self-enhancing extrinsic values to promote campaigns, what you're doing is you're modeling values which damage your campaigns, probably, okay? Because you're encouraging people to prioritize those self-enhancing extrinsic values, and you're suppressing the self-transcendent intrinsic values. Furthermore, you're activating those self-enhancing extrinsic values, which we saw increases the likelihood of behaving selfishly and decreases you being pro-social. On the other hand, when you use self-transcendent intrinsic values, this research suggests you're modeling the helpful values and you're momentarily activating the helpful values, which is going to suppress the unhelpful values. So what are the implications? First, I would suggest that you want to avoid activating or encouraging self-enhancing extrinsic values in your work. The second is that I think it's important to start to develop campaigns that look at the root causes of self-enhancing extrinsic values and to work on those, and Tom and I have written about those. And finally, encourage and activate the self-transcendent intrinsic values in your work, because this research suggests that may, in the long term, be more beneficial. I thank you for your attention.